You've heard many stories about drug organizations and the territories where they sold, but rarely have you heard about one that made money by operating as landlords of drug turf. This is the tale of two merciless gangsters and their gang, which controlled the drug trade in the area of the South Bronx as street corner proprietors and had a bloody and murderous reign over the neighborhood. George Nelson Calderon Jr. was born on June 12, 1956 in Carolina, Puerto Rico. His mother Anna left his father when George was a small child and took him and his two siblings to New York City. Anna and her three children moved into a furnished room on East 137th Street in the Mott Haven section of the South Bronx, an area which was home to a large amount of Puerto Rican migrants. By the early 1960s, Mott Haven had experienced a major economic decline. After many public housing developments were built in the area, it led to an influx of low-income residents and degraded into an impoverished and run-down ghetto full of crime, drug activity, and violence. George's mother got the family on welfare and soon remarried and would go on to have more children. George took to criminal activities at a very young age. He started off as a pickpocket, then graduated to other petty crimes. In an interview with George's sister, she states that when George was only 10 years old, some of his older friends got him using heroin, and his 12-year-old brother Frankie also began using the drug. When George's stepfather found out, he beat George and Frankie with a belt until they bled, and his discipline seemed to straighten out Frankie, who ceased using drugs, but George was undeterred. George rarely went to school and took part in various different crimes, one of which was stealing loot from freight trains at rail yards and then fencing the goods for cash. His stepfather tried other attempts to keep him away from the streets, such as by hiding his sneakers, but George would just go outside in his bare feet. He often came home with money that his mother and stepfather knew was obtained by illegal means, but at some point the questions and discipline ceased, as his contributions were helping to put food on the table for a struggling family. At age 14, George was caught stealing jewelry to buy narcotics, and by 15, he was already strung out on heroin. He then decided to switch over to cocaine, but soon wound up bouncing around drug treatment centers. George Calderon ran tightly with a young Puerto Rican hoodlum a few years his junior named George Gomez. Gomez and Calderon's families were friends, and even as a pre-adolescent, Gomez was known in the neighborhood. The two became close partners in crime and stuck people up, committed burglaries, and did anything else they could to make fast money. But their run was put on hold in 1973 when Calderon was arrested. One story alleges he was caught driving a car with a dead body in the trunk, but he was ultimately convicted on burglary and robbery charges and sentenced to a 6 to 18-year prison term. Throughout the 1970s, the South Bronx had devolved into an even more dismal landscape and experienced a large rise in crime and gang activity. Mott Haven became one of the most decayed sections. It had one of the largest concentrations of public housing and the lowest income rates in the entire city. The Diego Beekman houses were perhaps the most ill-reputed projects in Mott Haven, as it had a large amount of drug activity and only a small percentage of residents had jobs, with the rest being on public assistance. While Calderon was doing his time at Elmira Correctional Facility in upstate New York, his buddy George Gomez, who was now known in the streets as Money George, would head up there to visit him. Money George had come up during this time and began leading a gang named the Cypress Boys, which included his brothers as well as another local kid named Ishmael. They committed stickups, burglaries, and other crimes, becoming feared by many in the area. George Calderon was released after serving a little over 7 years of his sentence, then immediately reconnected with Money George and got involved with the Cypress Boys. By the time Calderon returned to Mott Haven, the Cypress Boys had grown in power and stature under Money George's leadership. The bond between Money George and Calderon became unshakable, and even though Calderon was a little older, he had a strong admiration for him and was influenced by his advanced street savvy.
Now known as just Calderon, or Cal for short, he took part in robberies, collections, and enforcement work. Cal had a propensity for violence and was very brutal, which earned him a fearsome and bloody reputation around Mott Haven. His involvement with the Cypress Boys led their name to grow even more notorious as a squad of dangerous hoods.
Calderon's half-brother Alberto Garcia, who was known as Easy Al, was an up-and-coming rapper who had released a single in 1980 called The Rappin' Spree with his group the Jazzy 3.
And I'm the Easy Al, yes, the king of style, super secret weapon of the disco town.
Also a member of the Jazzy 3 was Money George's younger brother Fonzie, who was known as Busy B.
Well, I'm the busy bee, love the dream machine. When I rock on the mic, you wanna know what I mean.
In January of 1982, Cal had a son named George Calderon III, but he died in June of the following year, with no further information on his cause of death.
With the members of the Cypress Boys now in their 20s and veterans by South Bronx street standards, Money George and his gang now had a stronghold of Cypress Avenue and earned money via various different means, including armed robberies. Money George also had a racket in which he extorted local businesses such as bodegas, who had to pay him a fee in order to operate on his turf. But as the gang's list of misdeeds grew, so did the enemies who were out for vengeance on Money George and the Cypress Boys.
On the morning of September 12, 1983, Money George was sitting in a car with his associate Ishmael and a female acquaintance named Melinda by St. Mary's Park in Mott Haven when a gunman approached the vehicle with a machine gun and unleashed a hail of bullets on all of them. Money George and Melinda died on the spot, while Ishmael clung to life for a few more days in the hospital before passing away. Money George was laid to rest in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. Money George's death had a profound impact on Calderon, who was devastated by the loss of his close companion and crime partner. But the way that Money George navigated the criminal world and died at such a young age in a gangland-style killing immortalized him as a street legend in Calderon's eyes. As Calderon turned his attention towards his own journey, he ascended up the underworld and quickly became a force to be reckoned with. He got involved with drug dealing and formed a group of people to move the product and to assist with operations. He had several more run-ins with the law, doing a few short jail stints for parole violations throughout the early 1980s.
In the years after crack hit New York City in 1985, the South Bronx and Washington Heights were the areas most affected by the drug in the entire nation, which resulted in a huge rise in hustlers looking to make a profit off of it. Mott Haven quickly turned into a booming crack market, and along with those still selling heroin, it became even more rampant with drug activity. Calderon's cousin, Angel Padilla, who was several years his senior, had come up to the Bronx from Puerto Rico in his late teens and was married with several children. He worked various low-paying jobs in factories and restaurants until Cal encouraged him to come join him. Padilla took him up on the offer, and Cal taught him the ways of the crime game, but Padilla already had the makings of a gangster and transitioned seamlessly to the life, becoming known around town as Cuson. They forged a partnership, and Cuson became Cal's second in command as they oversaw a crew which sold heroin around Brook Avenue.
In January of 1987, Calderon's half-brother Alberto Garcia died in suspicious circumstances from a gunshot wound to the head while Calderon was present. The details surrounding his death are vague, but it was explained as being the result of a game of Russian roulette, and nobody was ever charged in connection with it. As Cal and Cuson scaled up their drug operation, Calderon devised an additional method to earn cash. Recalling the days when Money George used to extort businesses by making them pay him a fee in order to earn money on his turf, Cal saw an opportunity to apply that tactic once again. Using his recognized ownership of certain blocks, Cal extorted drug dealers by making them pay him a rental fee in order to hustle on those corners. Calderon was good at planning and organizing while having a charisma that magnetized others, traits tailor-made for the crime boss role which he had his eyes set on becoming. He knew how to work his charm and often made nice monetary gestures to area residents in order to win them over, and even some of the local policemen developed an admiration of him. As is customary for those cut from his cloth, he was also capable of extreme viciousness and possessed a massive ego and a burning desire for recognition and the need to outdo others. Just as Cal and Cuson were building this venture of leasing corners to hustlers, in 1987, Calderon was sentenced to another prison term for a parole violation. But he wasn't going to be deterred by this temporary sidetrack. He relayed orders to Cuson and others from behind bars so they could maintain the foundations that he had laid. After Calderon went to prison, a Puerto Rican hustler named Grande had risen to become the prominent dealer of Cal's old turf. By 1989, he was leading a drug operation which was selling a heroin brand named D.O.A, which is short for Dead on Arrival, and was being sold on a bustling block right behind me, Brook Avenue between East 138th and 139th Streets.
Grande was a visible yet mysterious figure who could be seen without a shirt on in the summertime, showing off his fairly tall and solid stature covered in tattoos. He had gold teeth and rocked a gold chain with a large gold Jesus pendant, and always moved around with several bodyguards that he brought in from Puerto Rico. While Cal was in the New York State prison system, he kept an eye out for talent that he deemed fit to join the new crew he was assembling in preparation for his return to the streets. After serving 3 years for his parole violation, he was released in 1990 and returned to Brook Avenue to recontinue his career path of commanding the area's drug trade.
However, there was now some competition that Calderon needed gone so he could gain full control over the area, and that was Grande. Cal began sending messages to him in the form of subtle threats and overt intimidation. Grande saw the writing on the wall and knew that the treacherous go-getter was ready to cause mayhem in order to push him out. Satisfied that he had already made enough money from the game, Grande wasn't interested in a bloody war, so he forfeited his territory to Calderon and moved on, allegedly going back to Puerto Rico with plenty of riches to live comfortably. After Calderon and Cuson took over Grande's territory, they were now the owners of the D.O.A brand and were recognized as the new drug chieftains of East 139th and Brook Avenue and the streets surrounding it.
Calderon was a stocky, muscular man who was gregarious, but also quick-tempered and unpredictable. He was flashy, bold, and liked to show off. He wore thick gold chains and big rings. One of his hobbies was music, and he enjoyed playing bass and drums. He was a frequent cocaine user, and his brashness would become more pronounced while he was high on the drug. Cuson was a small, thin man with a thick mustache whose nondescript appearance belied his gangster nature, and in vast contrast to Calderon, he was low-key and dressed modestly. He was very stern, and behind closed doors he could flip a switch and unleash a frightening dark side. As the organization grew, so did Cuson's ruthlessness towards anyone who infiltrated on his business. He also had a keen interest in politics and sided heavily with the Republican Party. This was the principal location for the organization's business operations.
The gang's headquarters were in the building right behind me, 550 East 139th Street. The crew, which would come to be known as the CNC Gang, named after Calderon and Cuson, had wrested control over a 7-block radius of Mott Haven. The word was sent out that no outside hustlers could operate there unless approved of by CNC beforehand, otherwise severe repercussions would be handed out. The organization was built to run in a structured manner and had a strict set of rules and policies in place. Anyone who wanted to hustle in their territory would have to pay CNC a weekly fee, and the more lucrative locations which were busier with foot traffic, such as East 138th and Brook Avenue, would have a higher premium. Only dealers working for CNC could sell D.O.A. Any freelance corner renters were required to sell a different brand of heroin, and if they wanted to sell any other drugs such as crack, there would be an additional fee.
Dealers would pay per square on each sidewalk. The more money that a dealer made, the more squares that they got. If someone else sold anything on their rent space, they would tell Cal, and that person would be fined. Cal would then keep a percentage of the fine and pay out the rest to the other dealer for the money that they lost.
To maintain harmony with community residents, one day Cal set up a conference with dealers at the location right behind me, which was once called Children's Park. It's directly across the street from the gang's headquarters and was where users would come to purchase product. He forbade them from selling drugs while kids were going to and from school, placed a limit on how many addicts could gather together at one time at any specific location, instructed them to come unarmed, and to not sell in front of certain buildings. These rules were to be abided by under the threat of strict penalty, and those penalties were heavily enforced.
The CNC territory began at East 138th Street between Brook Avenue and St. Anne's Avenue. Then St. Anne's Avenue up to East 141st Street. Then East 141st Street between St. Anne's and Brook Avenue. Then Brook Avenue back down to East 138th Street.
With Mott Haven becoming a booming drug market, any hustlers who wanted to set up shop on those blocks knew who they had to pay in order to do so. Within a short span of time, the CNC gang had dozens of dealers paying them weekly tributes. The main sales locations were at the gang's headquarters and at Children's Park. Long lines of customers were forming at Children's Park, sometimes becoming so chaotic that a worker would have to bust off gunshots in the air to calm the crowds. Calderon carefully selected his staff, as he believed that a few quality men was more effective than a large group, as the bigger the circle, the more liabilities such as disloyalty and betrayal came with it.
He built a small mob of hand-picked convicts that he met during his various stays in the New York Department of Corrections. Some of the more notable recruits were two seasoned street hoods known as Spanky and Pirate. Thomas Spanky Morales was an outlaw biker from the Tremont area of the Bronx who had been in and out of prison for the prior 10 years on various charges. He was part of the mostly Puerto Rican 1% biker gang named the Chingalings, who had made some violent headlines since the 1960s. Alejandro Cintron, aka Pirate, and also known as Talik due to his involvement with the 5% Nation, had met Calderon while they were locked up together. Pirate came from the rugged Ingersoll houses in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and ran the streets as a stick-up kid. He was acquainted with Fort Greene street icons such as Killer Ben and notorious thug Kelvin 50 Cent Martin. His sense of style for early hip-hop fashion caught the attention of acclaimed street photographer Jamel Shabazz, which led to several iconic photos of Pirate being printed in multiple publications, such as the Source magazine, as well as on CD and cassette inserts. Pirate would also later become a member of the Chingalings.
After Pirate's release from prison, he moved up to the South Bronx to join Cal, and his younger brother Lex also accompanied him.
Due to some ongoing drug wars in the area, one night in late fall, Lex was involved in an exchange of gunfire inside the playground at PS 40 on East 140th Street, also known as the Devil's Playground, and was struck directly in his manhood with a bullet. Then there were other kids who Calderon had connected with in the prior years, such as young hoods who went by the names Supreme, Dollar Bill, and Rice and Beans. A few of Calderon's family members were also affiliated with this gang, including some cousins, and even his mother, known as Mama Calderon, had some involvement in his day-to-day operations. Then there were several associates, such as trusted old partners of Calderon's and some kids referred by other members.
By late 1990, this was the core of the original CNC gang, and this small group of men possessed enough fortitude to oversee a number of gangsters and hustlers in a dangerous landscape. While in the presence of his crew, Calderon often spoke fondly of his old crime companion, Money George, and referenced their interactions together.
The gang retained an attorney named John Marchicello as their house counsel, a former prosecutor for the Bronx D.A.'s narcotics unit. Marchicello assisted them with legal matters, but was also assisting them in illegal ways as well. Not the most astute or powerful attorney by any means, Marchicello's strength was mainly in his experience with drug cases and access to confidential information, which he used to bribe or threaten witnesses for his criminal clients.
In most cases, the amount of rent that CNC charged the dealer was determined by how much money that they could make at any specific location, and in some other cases, a flat weekly rate was imposed. With the drug market in Mott Haven getting bigger by the day, business was lucrative for the CNC gang. Their business gave the poor area something of an economic boost, as it offered many jobs to impoverished locals and gave them opportunities to work in the trade as dealers, lookouts, or even cash couriers.
Cuson had a thing against those who robbed people, especially if they did it on his turf. If any of his renting dealers were stuck up, Cuson would get every detail and description of the perpetrators to have them hunted down and dealt with accordingly. Soon, area crooks were deterred from robbing anyone in CNC's territory, which gave the dealers working there a sense of protection from stick-up kids.
Cal and Cuson also got a cut from the D.O.A. sales, and along with their roles as drug turf landlords, business was very profitable, and they pulled in tens of thousands of dollars a week from their drug dealing renters. Any dealers who didn't follow the rules would be fined, and if they couldn't come up with the weekly rent, first they would be warned. If they couldn't come up with the rent the second time, they would have their drugs taken and be kicked off the block for a week, and if there was a third time, it was severe. They would have their drug earnings or cars confiscated and also be subject to a beatdown. As for any outsiders who had the ill-advised boldness to set up on their turf without permission, they would pay a steeper price and wind up on the receiving end of a hitman's bullets.
Then there were others who were taken to the basement of their headquarters for questioning. If they were allowed to live, it would only be after they endured a brutal torture session first. Some stories allege that there was a table with pain-inflicting devices laid out on it, such as a hammer and hacksaw, and if anyone was brought there for an outstanding debt, Cuson would bring them a phone and allow them to make one call in order to find a way to clear it. Above the corner store, they used 2 rooms to count cash for each week's collections. In only a short time after the CNC gang's official formation, they were responsible for a number of killings. Not only were they eliminating rivals and witnesses, but also taking on murder contracts for other drug crews. From the time that CNC appeared on the scene, Mott Haven's 40th Precinct's murder rate began skyrocketing.
In the summer of 1990, a witness to a murder that the gang had committed on East 140th Street gave a statement to police, and when Cal found out, he had John Marchicello get him his name and address. They found the man and beat him with baseball bats and stuck a shotgun in his mouth, while Cal waved a copy of the man's police statement in front of him. Needless to say, the man never testified about the murder that he witnessed. There was a needle exchange program set up at Children's Park, where volunteers would hand out condoms and clean needles to addicted men and women to help curb sickness and disease contraction. When Cal discovered this, he enlisted some of his own men to hand out bottles of bleach and clean needles to addicts in order to keep his clientele healthy enough to keep purchasing his product. Cal's charm and personal demeanor had even won over some of the policemen in the South Bronx. After a CNC member was shot during a dispute and taken to the ER, cops showed up to interview him and fill out a police report. Cal went to check on him, and when he walked into the hospital room, he and the detectives were already familiar with each other, as they had been friendly beforehand. Realizing that the wounded kid was with the man that they knew as George, they disregarded the police report and left the hospital. The day after Thanksgiving in 1990, Spanky and another CNC affiliate named Joey Pillett were in attendance at the world-famous Palladium nightclub when they were involved in a shooting, which resulted in one bouncer being wounded and another being killed. The two men then jumped in a car and fled to the Bronx, and although they were not apprehended, they would soon become part of a major ordeal surrounding the incident after two other men were wrongfully convicted for the bouncer shootings. Calderon continued to play on his role as a ghetto Robin Hood to the Mott Haven residents. During the holidays, he would walk down the streets and throw fistfuls of cash into the air and watch people scramble for it, while proclaiming his title as the boss of the neighborhood. Then there were times when people would throw block parties and a CNC dealer would throw down cash to the crowd from the roof of a building. Cal would also pay for the burial expenses of poor neighbors who had passed away, and his acts of graciousness had earned him a savior status to many residents. But other locals simply observed as he dazzled the poor and vulnerable of the community, unimpressed by his spurious character of being a hero, and saw him for the unabashed criminal that he really was. Some of those who knew the real Cal were cautious and fearful of him. One of the drug-dealing corner renters spoke of his admiration for Calderon's business skills, but referred to him as evil personified.
As 1990 came to a close, the CNC gang ruled their turf with an iron fist and pulled in several $1 million just from their rental fees. The more profitable their business became, the more bodies were dropping. The 40th precinct of Mott Haven was in the top 5 most murderous precincts in the entire city for 1990, which is the same year that New York had its most homicides ever recorded. Willis Avenue, Brook Avenue, St. Anne's Avenue, and Cypress Avenue came to be known around town as the 4 Aves of Fear. The diabolical duo of Calderon and Cuson reveled in their roles as bosses and bloodletters, and their reigns as the dark overlords of the Mott Haven underworld had yet to even reach its peak.